Greetings, everybody. This is Amel Mouefi. I'm the Chief of Party for the USAID Scholars Activity implemented by the American University in Cairo. It's a great pleasure to be with you for this webinar. And we would like to welcome you to this webinar of the Gerhard Center webinar series entitled The Aftermath of COVID, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. Today, we are very honored to have with us Professor Robert Pollin, and the title of this webinar is Achieving a Zero Emissions Global Economy Through a Global Green New Deal. Professor Pollin is a distinguished university professor of economics and co-director of the Political Economy Research Institute, PERI, at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. He is also the founder and president of PERI, Pollin Energy and Retrofits, an Amherst, Massachusetts-based green energy company operating throughout the USA. He has worked as a consultant for the US Department of Energy, the International Labour Organization, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and numerous non-governmental organizations in several countries and in states and municipalities of the US on various aspects of building high employment green economies. He has also directed projects on employment creation and poverty reduction in sub-Saharan Africa for the United Nations Development Program. He has worked with many US non-governmental organizations on creating living wage statutes at both the statewide level and the municipal level, on financial regulatory policies and economies of single-payer healthcare in the United States. So join me in welcoming Professor PERI, Pollin, and also I'd like to hand it over to him to walk us through the presentation he has for us this webinar. The floor is yours, Bob.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Amal. It's really an honor to be speaking here. And what we have planned is for me to speak for roughly half an hour, and then I really look forward to a lively interchange in the remaining half hour. So as Amal said, the title of my presentation is Achieving a Zero Emissions Global Economy Through a Global Green New Deal. And I'm going to put up my PowerPoint presentation. So just to start with some basics, you're probably all familiar with this, but I think it's good to review anyway. First, let's just be clear on the severity of the crisis that we're faced and how we have to address the crisis. You probably heard about the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is an agency of the United Nations. They just put out their so-called sixth assessment report last month, August 2021. And this is, by the way, 3,500 page document. I can't claim to have read it all. I've read the summary. I will claim to have read the whole summary and skimmed other parts. But the basic message is the same message that they promulgated in 2018 in a report, which is that we need to be able to stabilize the global mean temperature at 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. Pre-industrial level meaning around the year 1800. So the global average temperature needs to be stabilized by the year 2100 at 1.5 degrees above what the pre-industrial level was. Now, this is a very significant number in and of itself, because prior to 2018, the IPCC was really accepting the idea that we could stabilize the global mean temperature, that global warming could stabilize at 2.0 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. They have now gotten much more focused on the necessity of keeping the average temperature lower, because the evidence is mounting that the impacts of climate change are becoming increasingly severe, and that we are already seeing, we already know it, it's happening before our eyes. It's not something that we have to predict into the future. We're looking at the heat extremes, heavy precipitation, droughts, biodiversity losses, and so forth. And we are experiencing the impacts on people's livelihoods, on food security, on water supply. This is all happening, and it is going to get worse. It's only going to get worse. The question is how much worse and whether we have the capacity, meaning the entire human race here, because we're talking about a global crisis, has the capacity to stabilize at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, the IPCC, and I should just say the IPCC is a UN agency. It does not itself conduct research. It gathers research from thousands of researchers around the issue of climate change, synthesizes it, puts out these big documents that are synthetic studies of what we could call the range of research in the field. Now, yes, there may be a few outliers that are going to say that this is all completely wrong, that climate change is a hoax, and so forth. We have such people in the US, but in any case, this is the IPCC represents a very, very broad consensus of research findings. Okay, and so what do they say we need to do? They don't just describe the problem, they address it in a way that enables us to advance solutions. So basically, the most basic thing that they say we need to do is two things. We have to cut carbon dioxide emissions by 50% as of 2030, which, by the way, is only a little more than 8 years from now. We have to cut our the way that we generate carbon dioxide emissions, as I'll get into more in a second, basically by burning fossil fuels to produce energy. We have to cut that by 50%. And by 2050, we have to eliminate emissions from carbon dioxide entirely. Now, the Biden administration here in the US has embraced these goals. They've said that these are the Biden administration's own goals for our country. Similarly, in Europe, the European Union has embraced actually a moderately more aggressive set of goals. But so those are the goals that we have to reach. Now, I want to just give you some sense of the nature of the challenge. So how serious are we in terms of where the trajectory is with respect to global warming? So what you're looking at here in this time series graph is the average global mean temperature from 1880 to now, to the present, to 2020. Here, this is 0.0 means that the average global temperature is at the pre-industrial level. So while we've had, obviously, an industrial development occurring well before 1880, 1870, as you can see, the average global temperature remained below the global mean temperature, moderately below, by 0.2 to 0.4 degrees. We only start to see increases in the global average temperature around 1940. And even then, it is not a consistent pattern of rising average global temperatures. It's really not until 1980, 41 years ago, not until 1980 that we start to see a persistent increase in the global mean temperature that is continuing to the present. And we are at the point in this graph, it's showing us that we are basically at 1 degree Celsius above the global mean temperature. The IPCC report that came out in August actually said, well, really, we're at 1.1 degree above the global mean temperature. So we don't have a whole lot of room left for temperatures to increase. That is, if we are going to maintain the global mean temperature within 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level, we only have 1/2 of 1 degree to go, or maybe even a little bit less. And as you can see, just from the year 2000 on, we were at about a half a degree. We were at 0.5 degrees above. So in the last 20 years only, we've gone from a half degree above the global mean temperature to 1 full degree. So if this trajectory were to continue, we will breach the 1.5 degree threshold in a mere 20 years. That's where we are. Okay, and I just want to refer to one other UN report. The UN, I think, has been doing really fundamental, outstanding work, more than any other set of institutions, in tracking this crisis and in proposing solutions. And in their report from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which just came out last February, the UN Secretary General Guterres summarized that report from February. And you can just see, I want to just highlight a couple of lines here. He says, 2021 is a make or break year to confront the global climate emergency. The science is clear. To limit global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we must cut emissions by 45% as of 2030 relative to 2010 levels. So he's saying that this report, what he's calling, is a red alert for our planet. We're nowhere close to the level of ambition needed to hit this 1.5 degree stabilization point. Now, he said that in February 2021, and he said 2021 is a make or break year. Well, now we are almost at the end of September of 2021, and let's just say we haven't accomplished a whole lot. There's been a lot of good discussion. There's certainly a lot more coverage. There is the big conference coming up, UN IPCC sponsored conference in the UK in November. But what we really, really desperately need is firm commitments to take action to hit these targets if we are going to take this climate emergency seriously. Okay, so what do we have to do to take the climate emergency seriously? Well, the first thing is very straightforward. We have to stop burning fossil fuels to produce energy. It's that simple. We have to stop burning oil, coal, and natural gas to produce energy. Why? Because burning fossil fuels to produce energy is responsible for roughly 70, or even in the latest report from the IPCC, maybe upwards 75% or above. I tried to keep it moderate, the lower level, let's say 70, 75%. 75% roughly of the problem is burning oil, coal, and natural gas to produce energy. And so that therefore we have to stop producing, and we have to stop consuming fossil fuels to produce energy. There you have it. We have to get to the point at which we can zero out, or almost close to zero out, fossil fuel energy in 30 years. And if we do it now instead of waiting, we can do it in a way such that, yes, it will be significant cuts. But if you do the simple math, right now we would look at an absolute level of contraction of about 3% per year, which is a lot, but it is manageable. But we have to do it every year. Every year that we postpone it, that means that the percentage cut in subsequent years has to be greater. Now, if we're going to eliminate fossil fuels as an energy source, they are the dominant energy source in the world. And of course, the global economy runs on energy. Buildings, transportation systems, industry, all run on consuming energy to run machines, to operate machines of various sorts. That's it. That's why we consume energy. So we have to have an alternative. We can't just say we're going to stop burning fossil fuels. We have to have a substitute. And so what I propose, and of course it's not just me, but what I'm proposing now is that we think of two primary alternatives to fossil fuel as our primary energy source. One is that we raise efficiency standards dramatically, okay, that we can, with available simple technologies, we have the capacity to raise energy efficiency standards in the range of 40, 50, 60% relative to where they are today. So that means that we have much more efficient cars, or we have electric vehicles. We depend much more on public transportation systems that are efficient. We use heat pumps, electric heat pumps, to heat and cool buildings. We use LED lights to light buildings. In industrial production, we use combined heat and power systems, so we don't waste energy in industry. These are the various things that we need. And so what I'm proposing is that we invest heavily in raising energy efficiency standards. Okay, so energy efficiency standards can get us to the point where we will be able to stabilize our demand for energy even as global economy grows. But then we have to have an alternative energy source. And so again, I'm proposing, not just me, that we use renewable energy, clean renewable energy sources as our primary low carbon, zero carbon energy source. And that means primarily solar power, wind power, but also as supplemental sources, geothermal, hydro, and low emissions bioenergy. Okay, now the work I've done, research I've done on modeling this, I'm estimating that we need to spend in the range of 2.5% of global GDP every year in energy efficiency and renewable energy in order to hit these targets, in order to hit the 50% reduction by 2030 and to be at zero by 2050. So this is a lot of money, obviously. On average, between now and 2050, it would amount to about $4.5 trillion per year. That's a lot of money. On the other hand, it's 2.5% of GDP. It's not 25% of GDP. It's not even 15. It's not even 10. It's not even 7. 2.5% of GDP is manageable in the sense that it still tells us that 97.5% of GDP can be spent on everything else. But we have to spend the 2.5% per year. Now, and right now we are spending, we're not spending enough, but we are spending in the range of about 0.5% of GDP. So we have to ratchet that up from 0.5% to 2.5%. That's a 5-fold increase. That is the first challenge. Okay, now why did I focus on energy efficiency and renewables as opposed to other technologies, nuclear energy and carbon capture? And we can get into this a lot if you want in the discussion. I will just mention some really quick points that maybe can motivate later discussion. So the simplest answer is these are efficient technologies. They are available right now and they're cheap and they work. They're safe. Nuclear energy is not safe and it is not cheap. Carbon capture technology is unproven at commercial scale after decades of trying. Maybe it will become commercially viable. So far, we don't have evidence that it is. And we don't have a lot of time to wait for entirely new technologies to come on board on a global scale. So let me just show you some evidence just on the point of costs. And these are from data from the US Energy Department, comparing costs for a kilowatt of electricity as of the year 2026. As you can see, solar, wind, geothermal are roughly half the cost, not even close. They're half the cost of nuclear and they're half the cost of burning coal with carbon capture. And I would also note similar results. The International Renewable Energy Agency, another UN agency, outstanding agency, I don't know if you've heard of it, IRENA, which actually is located in Abu Dhabi. I've done some work with them as well. So they just put out a report in June, just a couple of months ago, in which the latest evidence that they have is that the renewable capacity, that 62% of newly installed renewable capacity, meaning primarily solar and wind, was cheaper than the cheapest fossil fuel alternative. That's how far renewable energy has come relative to fossil fuel. So if you are just a hard-headed business person, you don't care about climate change at all, you just want to figure out how to get the cheapest electricity into your machines to make the machines run, the best way to go at this point historically is renewable energy. And I'm trying to get the next, let's see. Okay, good. In addition to the energy transformation, we need to think equally about transforming our global agricultural system. As I said, burning fossil fuels to produce energy is responsible for roughly 30%, maybe it's 20, now I'm saying 70%, maybe it's 75%, but the rest is primarily from agriculture. And that's responsible for another 25 to 30% of all emissions. And what do I mean there? Well, there are basically two sources of emissions coming from the agricultural system or land use. The first is deforestation. So deforestation, meaning starting with the Amazon, destroying the Amazon, chopping down the forestry, the trees in the Amazon, is releasing CO2 into the atmosphere because trees store CO2. So you release it when you chop down a tree, and then you also don't have the tree there to absorb the CO2 because it's been chopped down. Now people say, oh yes, well we can plant more trees. Yes, you can plant more trees, but it'll take 40 to 50 years before they grow to the extent that they have the absorptive capacity of the tree you chop down. So we simply have to stop deforestation. And then secondly, in the area of land use and agriculture, is to supplant our industrial agricultural practices that are dominant, that are heavily dependent on nitrogen fertilizer to support the growth of crops. Nitrogen fertilizer is based on natural gas, and it is releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. In addition to that, when you mix the nitrogen fertilizer with the soil, again, it does not have the absorptive capacity that organic soil with the organic plants have in the soil. And so what we need to do is focus on reforestation and using organic farming practices as natural sources of carbon capture. And that will be the way through which we can address this other 30% of emissions. Okay, now I mentioned at the title that we're talking about a global Green New Deal. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, I can't assume that everybody who is not in the United States knows the term the New Deal to begin with. This was the term that characterized the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, the New Deal. And it was a program to overcome the Great Depression of the 1930s and to do it in a way that advanced a more egalitarian agenda, a more egalitarian version of capitalism than what we had seen before. It was the beginning of what we in the US would call a welfare state version of capitalism. So the global Green New Deal is supposed to evoke that period of progress, experimentation in the 1930s in the United States, but with this difference, number one, that it also has to embrace an ecological agenda. It has to address climate change in particular. And secondly, it can't just be in the United States, it has to be global. Because again, the crisis of climate change is global. Now, so I'm going to describe a little bit some of my own research again here. This idea of investing to build a global clean energy economy, to supplant the fossil fuel dominant economy with one which is primarily built around renewable energy and energy efficiency, will be a source of job creation. Anything you invest in creates jobs. Anything. You want to, build a bubble gum factory in Cairo, it will create jobs. The outcome is not going to be necessarily all that beneficial socially, but it will create jobs. So the question here is, with this 2.5% of GDP every year, how many jobs are we going to get? So this is a question that I've been working on with co-authors, some former students, current students, PhD students, for several years now. And of course, you can't get a really hard and fast number here, but what I'm looking at in general is roughly in the range of about 160 million jobs per year through clean energy investments, which, by the way, is a higher number than our friends at the ILO have recently come up with. And we can debate, but anyway, that's the number that I think is a reasonable number. Let me just show you what I mean here. What we're looking at is a tables that show comparison of ratios of job creation in US dollars per $1 million for the clean energy programs versus maintaining the existing fossil fuel infrastructure. And the critical column here is this third one, when we compare job creation through clean energy investments versus fossil fuels. And just quickly, we have these countries: Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, and the US. You can see that what we get is 2 to 3 times more jobs per dollar of expenditure in all of these countries, which, by the way, are all fossil fuel producers. Okay, all fossil fuel producers, you double job creation or even triple in the case of Indonesia. And then these other 3 countries I include because these are countries that are complete fossil fuel importers. So everything you do to build a clean energy infrastructure in Germany, South Korea, and Spain is going to be a net increase in employment. So this is going to be a major source of job creation. And that's why I say it is an integral part of what we talk about when we say a global Green New Deal. Now, the global Green New Deal, the transition to a clean energy, global energy system will have other benefits. It will certainly have public health benefits by reducing air pollution, outdoor air pollution. It will create opportunities for alternative ownership forms. I'm not saying that we just have public ownership. We basically already have public ownership of most fossil fuel assets in the world. 90% of fossil fuel assets today are publicly owned. So just to say, well, we're going to get rid of the big corporations and have public ownership is not a solution. The solution is clean energy, and we can create smaller scale energy systems that are conducive to community ownership, local ownership, can be produced in remote rural areas. Some of the most interesting new developments in the United States around clean energy have been in Alaska, in remote areas of Alaska. And by the way, they only have sun 6 months a year, but they're doing okay. They figured out having integrated clean energy systems. And as we see it, it's going to lower energy costs. Now, it is true, if we're thinking about this in terms of the global Green New Deal, and we're thinking about it in terms of human well-being, people are going to lose their jobs. It's not just the jobs are going to get created, though they are. They're going to be people that are going to lose their jobs. And those are the people that are dependent on the fossil fuel industry. So an integral part of the overall project has to be transition for all the workers and the communities that are currently dependent on the fossil fuel industry. And I mean this on a global scale as well. In other words, we have to have the transition policies as fully integrated into the Green New Deal project in terms of workers with respect to their pensions, getting new jobs, guaranteeing new jobs, retraining and relocating them as needed. Maybe they don't need it, but if they do, it should be available. Communities, the communities that are fossil fuel dependent, we need to clean up the land that has been damaged because it's been used for mining oil or pumping up oil and gas, mining coal, and we need to figure out ways to repurpose the land. A lot of interesting things are being done at initial scale. The most interesting, I would say, so far is in Germany, in the Ruhr Valley, which had been the main coal region of Germany, is now transitioning into heavy use development of various kinds of renewable energy projects. Okay, so just to wrap up, the Green New Deal, in my view, is available to us right now. As you saw, the costs of clean energy are low, the technologies are available, it will create jobs, and it will create jobs in the short term, like starting now. Investing now will create jobs and will help us continue to move out of the severe recession that we just experienced globally with COVID. Over the long term, it is Green New Deal is a climate stabilization project that will expand decent work, as the ILO has made its focus for decades. It will expand decent work, and as such will contribute toward raising mass living standards, fighting poverty. It's the way to go for now. So I will end there and we can have a discussion. Thank you for your time.
Bob, thank you so much for a very inspiring and interesting presentation, and it sparked a lot of comments and questions in my mind, and I'm sure the same for the participants. So let's see if our participants have any comments. I see Sharwet Ibrahim raising her hand. So if Sharwet, I think the organizers will be able to unmute you. So please introduce yourself and provide your question.
Thank you, Bob, for being here. With us here. I'm faculty also at the American University in Cairo, associate professor of supply chain management. Also working in this area and working closely with Prime Africa, developing a chapter here. So all what you're saying, of course, is encourageable. The documentation is so helpful for our classrooms and what we use to with our students to show exactly the impact of what's happening. A general question and then two specifics, okay? One has to do with the variation in the job levels in the countries that are producing fossil fuels. Why do you think it's lower for like the top ones in the column instead of the lower ones, like in the US, for example, it's 135 plus versus much lower than? That's one thing I'm interested in, especially if it relates to our country. And for energy, if that's a question. The second one is the energy efficient savings or initiatives. As part of the GDP calculation is a bit confusing for the 2.5 you're asking us to put out there. And again, which GDP is a very good question, of course. And I guess the general question is, sorry to put this on you, is like, how would you adjust, you're talking to, again, mainly a Cairo relevant audiences. How would you have adjusted this presentation if you were presenting to someone in Germany, Europe versus Cairo?
Great questions. Thanks very much, Sherwood. So the job numbers, why we have differences. Should I put the slide back up? Would that help?
Yeah, that'll be nice. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll put it back up. Whoops. Okay, and now I just do this. Right. Well, first of all, the real answer is I actually don't know why we have these differences. What we've done, and this is not just my own work, it's with co-authors, and a lot of this work also was done with United Nations, UNIDO, United Nations Industrial Development Organization. We use the available data, which is called the input-output data, through which we're able to generate ratios of this exact ratio, job creation per $1 million. And there are a lot of methodological pitfalls here. For example, converting $1 million into another country's currency and so forth. So these are the numbers that fall out from the from using the available input-output data, the highest quality data that are available.
Right.
And then in terms of why, we have these large differences in production functions, in the ways production takes place. Obviously, we're going to generally have more labor-intensive kind of production methods in countries that are lower wage countries. That's about as far as I can go on it, other than to just say, these are the results. One of my former graduate students did the work in China, and she's Chinese. And she pushed her research further in China by actually looking at the job quality in all cases. I mean, we do job quality work in all of these countries, but she really went into it, and really she found that, a very high proportion of the jobs in China are what we would call informal, so that we don't really have really careful data on wages and so forth, because they are jobs that are people paid on daily bases, sometimes in cash and so forth. So I welcome, if you want to go in with us and to understand these differences over time and differences between countries, that would be great. If you want, I mentioned the difference I had with the ILO. I wrote an article on an outstanding ILO study on exactly this question, and I learned a lot from the study, but I think they really miscalculated these employment numbers by a lot. And they haven't come back at me, so I'm going to assume they've conceded the point, and my estimates are better than theirs. On efficiency, so basically what I'm talking, the 2.5% of GDP was not, I didn't say, let's start at 2.5% of GDP. What we did was we looked at basically the engineering literature that's relevant for all various kinds of efficiency interventions, as well as the renewable interventions. We looked at that engineering literature and said, okay, this is how much it costs to achieve a given amount of efficiency. Now, of course, we have to aggregate. Efficiency means a whole lot of things, but there is some really good research done that we were able to aggregate. So we come up with a number. Now, the difference between the efficiency investments and the renewables, one difference is critical. Well, two, let's say. Yeah. One is, if you want to reduce emissions by the least cost method for the next decade or so, the best investment is efficiency. It costs maybe 1/7 to 1/8 to achieve a given level of efficiency versus to expand renewable energy. It's going to cost you 10 to 15% to get that efficiency gain. Now, the second point, though, is, efficiency only gets you so far. At a certain point, you still have to deliver energy. So we need the renewable investments, but efficiency is the best way to start. And then let's see, you had a third question. What was that one? Sorry.
It related a little bit to maybe the gaps and also the data for Brazil and China compared to the US, because this is the kind of questions that you bring to the table. So again, the efficiency ratio you talked about, which I think happens more for efficiency reasons or cost saving reasons in Cairo more than investments, at least local investments, I would say are sometimes net efficiency. So you're using investments or initiative costs to reduce costs, and it might be tricky to really measure those effects, unlike an additional investment on top of how you would invest in a new business or a new venture for renewable energy. So that's why I was confused for that.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, another difference, of course, with efficiency is, the day after you install an electric heat pump in a building, you are saving money the next day. If you go from a a big gas guzzling internal combustion engine car to a hybrid or an electric vehicle, you are saving on electricity and energy the next day. So you can pay for your investments through your savings over time. And a lot of the financing structures that we need to capture those savings and offer the consumer the benefit of paying out their loans through savings.
I guess the direction is that I think it makes a difference where you are in the world for this short-term versus long-term investment, for the job, difference in jobs produced and everything. And that's why, I mean,
totally agree.
Yeah. All right.
Every place has a different story.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm doing another study right now for South Korea and another one for Greece. And South Korea, that I think of it as a pretty advanced technologically country, actually is operating at a very low level of energy efficiency, way below the global average. And so, one of the things I'm proposing is, this is some simple way to get emissions down in South Korea, because they're just not operating their economy in an efficient way.
Gotcha. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you so much, and lovely to have you with us at AUC.
Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 hands raised, and I just want to remind participants that they could also use the chat box option if they want to do that. So we start with Vinay Sharma and then Winnie Michula. So we will take them consecutively. Vinay, please, the floor is yours.
Yes. Yes, I have a basic question, Robert, regarding this, the mega projects like Belt and Road Initiative. So what are your views regarding it? Because they are the ones which are basically the, creating a bad apple environment. They are basically very, very confusing and complicating the environment, because with trillions of investment that is going to go into these infrastructure projects like power, aviation, road building, etc., and all of them is not going to be on clean energy. So they are going to be the one basically which are going to be generating a lot of emissions as far as the future is concerned, and there is hardly any sort of regulation regarding it at the global level, because the China is participating into it and they have got massive capital regarding it. And my second question is regarding the investment that basically the clean energy is talking about, because at this point of time going through such type of thing at one go is going to be very, very dangerous at this point of time, simply because supply chains are not efficient enough, because we are already going through a pandemic type of situation, and the developing nations simply are running through some kind of economic crisis. So putting pressure on them to use solar, coal, is going solar, wind, etc., is going to be very, very, not going to be, is going to impact their economy at some point of time, and is simply going to, somewhat slow the movement of goods and services. And the wind and solar, etc., some of these energies use a lot of, what you call, inputs, etc., space, land, etc. Sometimes these land, etc., is in very short supply. So how does one make, create efficiency under such type of circumstance? And a lot of these, technologies are not well developed also at this point of time and can't be produced at scale. So putting a price tag as saying that simply at a binary that they are going to be using half unit of what exactly the fossil fuel is is not going to be at this point of time a right what you call a right number, simply because the scale is so small at this point of time. So my basic question is that how do you address these two challenges? One of these is regarding these mega projects like Belt and Road, and secondly about creating such type of technologies for developing nations and supply chains which are already very which are going through some kind of economic headwind. So basically they will need a lot of support from the at macro level to bring some kind of efficiency at scale, and that will take a lot of time. That can't happen at one go, or in so how do you address that? Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks for the question. Well, my first response is, if we believe climate science, then we really don't have much choice here. It's not like we can say, well, there's a lot of problems with renewable energy, and therefore we can't pursue it, at least not in the foreseeable future. I don't see there as being any choice if we take climate science seriously. So that therefore we have to transition out of fossil fuels, out of consuming fossil fuels. We have to do it now, as the Secretary General of the UN said. This was supposed to be our big year, 2021. Well, some things are happening, but we're not moving close enough to the scale necessary. In terms of issues around supply chain and developing economies, well, sure, there's certainly been a breakdown of supply chains in the short term due to the COVID pandemic, and we have to repair those. Again, it's just something that has to be done. Maybe the structure of the supply chains may change, but note here that renewable energy actually, for the most part, entails much less development of a long supply chain than fossil fuel energy. I mean, yes, we have to create that infrastructure, but if you think about supply chains and renewable energy, I mean, we can be in rural sub-Saharan Africa and put up wind and solar farms that will supply electricity to regions that simply have not had it. No matter what politicians have promised for decades and decades, they haven't delivered electricity in most of sub-Saharan Africa. This offers an opportunity to do it precisely because it's less, it entails less infrastructure development than fossil fuel alternatives. In terms of the cost, so my estimate of 2.5% of GDP is actually an inflated number, deliberately inflated relative to what the engineering literature would tell me the cost is. In fact, the numbers that I showed here, so the solar PV, onshore wind, and geothermal, we calculate that on the basis of levelized cost of electricity, which includes everything, which includes capital expenditures, which includes transmission costs, includes maintenance. And so what I did, and the way I come up with my numbers for the 2.5% of GDP, I take the number that these research does on capital expenditures. And then the capital expenditures necessary to hit a level of energy supply. So I take those numbers and I pretty much double them. So my number of 2.5% of GDP is not like a knife edge issue that, we can maybe hit that number. If you believe the research coming out of the engineering literature at all, then my 2.5% of GDP number is high. It's, well above what the results would be from the engineering literature per se. Moreover, there have been, it's not just me, the International Renewable Energy, again, an outstanding organization, they did their own study that came out a few months ago and basically came out with the same number that I did in terms of the costs of hitting the 1.5 degree stabilization point. And then a third agency, the International Energy Agency, the largest institution doing research around these questions, also came out with a study within the last couple of months, and they also came in at basically the same number. So I think these are legitimate numbers. And the question then, the last part, which I took to be is, yes, 2.5% of GDP is still a big number. And it applies to developing countries just like the advanced economies. What I propose is that the advanced economies need to finance this basically mostly on a global scale themselves. The advanced economies are responsible for having created climate change, created the crisis, and that we bear the responsibility to deliver the financing. And if you look at some of my work, I have a small recent book. You can see I work out some of the financing issues. I can't go through it in detail now, but we can later if you want to do it online or if there's time at the end. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have Winnie, you have been raising up your hand for some time now, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I just would like to say a word and hear what Robert has to say on just transition, which is a great idea in the context of addressing energy efficiency. But the proposals you share, that to guarantee pension and jobs at equal pay. If I just try to reflect on my situation, for example, being in Africa, I find that is pretty difficult for African states to do this, because if I take, for example, social protection, where Africa is dedicated to spend 5% of the GDP, hardly quarter of them get to spend even 2% of the GDP on social protection. And really, this just is all in the terrain of social protection. So I'm just wondering if you project on a case where you are more familiar with the many countries you are studying. Do people approximate this, especially economies equivalent to African states, that they would be able to allocate some 2.5, for example, to cushion for, or rather, can they allocate even 1% to 3 to cushion and provide this just transition that is required? Thank you.
So actually, I've done a lot of research on quantifying the cost of just transition. Basically, so far in the United States, and I mentioned my former student and co-author having done similar work for China. So we haven't done it for Africa, but let me just tell you, where things, I'm not suggesting that the situation in the United States is going to be equivalent to say South Africa. I have done a little work on it, but not nearly enough. But in the numbers, and of course, I'm not going to be the one to decide what the just transition program is, but I modeled out a very generous just transition program. In other words, that people's pensions are guaranteed, that they are guaranteed another job, that they're guaranteed another job at equal pay, at least for 3 years, that they are guaranteed support and retraining and relocation. And I can send you a reference to a paper I did that came out about 6 months ago, which works through this for the United States. And the costs average out in the United States to about $2 billion per year. Now, $2 billion is a lot of money, but $2 billion is less than 1/100% of GDP. So in other words, it's peanuts. It's nothing. And it's not like we don't have a robust fossil fuel industry. We do. There's about 1.5 million people that are employed in oil and gas. There's about 60,000 people employed in coal. But that's in a labor force of 165 million. I've done a little bit for another country, Greece, and it's a similar kind of thing. In the whole country, Greece, it's obviously a much smaller economy. There's only 6,000 people employed in coal, totally. That includes the miners and everybody else. So I think it's important to really get a handle on this and understand how much it will cost. And we have to start with really estimating how many people we're talking about. And remember, we're talking about a transition over 30 years. So it's not like in the United States, as an example, there's 1.5 million people employed. They're not going to all lose their jobs tomorrow. This is going to be spread out over 30 years. So 1/30 are going to lose their jobs every year. So that's, 40,000 people a year in an economy with 165 million. This is easily manageable, especially when we understand that we spread it out over time. And in doing so, we also take account of the demographics, that some people are over this 30-year period, most of the people are going to be retiring voluntarily. So yes, we have to guarantee their pensions, but it's not like we have to find everybody a new job. So that's the way in which I've approached this issue of just transition. I take your points very seriously because again, like I said, we don't have any choice to transition out of fossil fuels. We just have to. Similarly, we have to provide the just transition, because if we don't, the political opposition to a Green New Deal is going to slow down progress to the point where nothing is going to happen for decades.
Okay, thank you, Bob, for that. And we have one other question from Faris Raab. So I will ask Faris to pose his question, and probably this will be the last question because we are almost coming to the time. So Faris, please go ahead.
Okay, hi, Mr. Pollin. My name is Faris. I'm a grade 10 student, and I found this meeting interesting to join.
Thank you.
I have a suggestion to help with the agriculture problem, and I'm starting to see it these days. My suggestion is using the hydroponic systems, because not only does it reduces the greenhouse gas emissions, but it also fixes the impact that is happening because of these gases. Let me tell you some of what I call perks of having hydroponic system. Second. First of all, it maximizes space because, as you know, it only works with water, so it does not take that much space. Second of all, it conserves a lot of water, and I've read that it takes like 10 times use water less than actually planting in soil. Another thing is it produces higher yields. It needs no soil, produces high quality food, and reduces supply chain. And it helps crops grow faster. So can you please tell me what you think about these hydroponic systems?
All right, well, I'm going to confess, you probably know a lot more about hydroponics than I do. So I am not an agricultural economist. I've researched it in the context of this issue around climate change and emissions. And what the research that I've studied, I haven't contributed any myself. The research that I've studied looks very favorably on the development of organic soil-based agriculture. And this is like, if you look at the work of the IPCC, for example, I haven't seen like a lot of emphasis in the research that says hydroponics is a big part of the solution. That doesn't mean it isn't true. It means that I just haven't seen it, and I won't claim expertise. So what you're saying sounds very exciting, and now that you've told me, I'm going to look much more seriously into it.
Thank you, Bob, for that. I mean, before we go, I just had a very quick question for you myself, and that was on the promise of green jobs. You speak about the short term and the longer term and the potential for decent work and all that, but I'm also concerned about the brown jobs, or the jobs where we are working in the green economy, yet their conditions of work are not fulfilling and where there is sort of exploitation of labor. So I think this is an area that we also need to address, because not all what shines is gold one way or the other.
So great, thank you for raising that. I mean, a big part of our research is to connect the idea of employment expansion through green investments with raising job quality. And I'll just cite, we put out, myself and co-authors put out a study in the state of California here in the US in June, which focused on these issues around job quality and the opportunities. Of course, they're not going to be good jobs just because they're jobs. And in fact, if you look at the quality characteristics of jobs in the green economy today versus the fossil fuel industry, starting with wages, the fossil fuel jobs are better. They're a lot better. We have to recognize that. But the point is, those fossil fuel jobs weren't always, the idea of a coal miner having a really good job was certainly not historically true. It became a good job through organizing, through unions fighting for the well-being of workers. And that is going to be the case here in the development of the green economy. In fact, our study in California was endorsed by 20 unions. I think that's the first, including the oil refinery workers that are saying, we know we're going to have to phase out fossil fuels. These are our jobs. We do make a lot of money. They average about $100,000 a year. Those jobs are going to go away. So we have to be able to provide this just transition, and unionization, labor standards, affirmative action, training, all of those things have to be part of the package of the Green New Deal.
Thank you for that. And while the webinar is sort of coming to a close or to an end, I'm sure the discussion will continue. You have sparked a lot of interest and a lot of inspiration. So I think you will be having to commit some time to the follow-up questions that will be coming back.
Very happy to. Very happy
basis. And on that, I'd like to thank you so much for this insightful webinar and the great discussion. And I would also like to thank all our participants in this webinar. And I would also like to invite them to the next webinar on Monday, the 20th of September at exactly the same time, 7 p.m. Cairo local time. The new webinar will be on human rights and the built environment life cycle, as you can see on the screen right now. And this will be moderated by Professor Mayer Ibrashi, who's the founder and chair of the Megaura Built Environment Collective. And the speakers will be Annabelle Short, the senior advisor for Built Environment and Institute for Human Rights and Business. And last but not least, Yahya Shaukat, the co-founder of 10 Tuba, a housing and spatial justice research studio. So looking forward to everybody's participation to this webinar. And once again, thank you all. Have a very good evening and rest of the day, whatever time zone you are.
Bob, I just want to thank you for a fantastic webinar. Amal, also,
great.
I want to thank you for moderating.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you. And
Thank you.
yes, of course, any follow-up, I'm totally open, happy to do it.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.